The stagecoach rattled into Jamestown, California on a blistering afternoon in August of 1876, carrying a young woman who had just enough coins in her pocket to buy one meal and nowhere to sleep when darkness fell. Olivia Vance pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, watching the frontier town materialize through the heat shimmer like something from a fever dream, and wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her life by answering that carefully worded advertisement seeking a bride for a cattle rancher she had never met. The letter in her reticule had been read so many times that the creases threatened to tear through the paper entirely. She had memorized every word during the long journey from Pennsylvania, where her parents' deaths from influenza had left her with nothing but debts, and the unwanted attention of her uncle who looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl. The advertisement had seemed like divine providence when she found it tucked between the pages of a newspaper at the boarding house where she worked washing sheets until her hands cracked and bled. A respectable rancher seeking a wife of good character, willing to work hard and build a life together in California. No promises of wealth or ease, just honesty and partnership. She had written back immediately, using her last decent sheet of writing paper, and 3 weeks later received a response with enough money for passage west and instructions to meet him at the Jamestown station. The coach lurched to a stop in front of a weathered building that served as both depot and general store, sending up clouds of red dust that coated everything within 20 feet. Olivia gathered her carpet bag, which contained all her worldly possessions, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, and a small Bible with her family names written inside the cover. The driver helped her down with a grunt that might have been sympathy or indifference. She could not tell which. The heat struck her like a physical blow after the relative shelter of the coach. Pennsylvania had been warm in summer, but this was something entirely different, a dry, scorching heat that seemed to pull the moisture from her lungs with each breath. She stood beside her bag, suddenly aware of how travel-stained her gray dress had become, how the hem was dark with dust, and the collar wilted despite her best efforts to keep presentable. Around her, the town hummed with activity. Men in dusty work clothes led horses down the rutted Main Street. A woman in a faded calico dress swept the boardwalk in front of what appeared to be a restaurant. Somewhere a dog barked, and the sound of a hammer striking an anvil rang out from a blacksmith shop. She waited as the other passengers dispersed, each apparently knowing exactly where they were headed. A businessman in a suit that had seen better days strode toward the hotel across the street. A Chinese man carrying mysterious bundles disappeared around a corner. A family with 3 small children was met by relatives with embraces and exclamations of joy. And Olivia stood alone, scanning the diminishing crowd for a face she had never seen, looking for a man who knew her only through carefully composed letters that revealed little of who she truly was. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then half. The stage driver gave her a long look before climbing back onto his seat and guiding the horses toward what she assumed was a livery stable. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she felt perspiration gathering at her temples, between her shoulder blades, beneath the high collar of her dress. Perhaps he had changed his mind. Perhaps he had seen her step from the coach and decided she was not what he wanted after all. Perhaps the whole thing had been some kind of cruel joke, though what kind of man would spend money on a train ticket for such a purpose, she could not imagine. She was considering whether she had enough money for a single night's lodging when she heard the approach of a horse moving at an easy canter. She turned and saw a man riding toward the depot on a gray mare that looked as tired as Olivia felt. The rider was tall and lean, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who spent every day outdoors. He wore work clothes that had been mended in several places, a hat that had seen many seasons, and boots that were scuffed but well cared for. As he drew closer, she could see that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps only in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a startling blue against his tanned face. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot and approached her slowly, removing his hat as he did so. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and Olivia felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "Miss Vance." His voice was deep and surprisingly gentle, with none of the rough edges she had expected. "I am Dalton Granger. I apologize for being late. We had trouble with one of the bulls getting through a fence, and it took longer than expected to get him back where he belonged." She managed a nod, her throat suddenly too dry for words. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his work shirt stretched across broad shoulders. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, his features too weathered and angular for that, but there was something solid and dependable in his bearing that made some of the tension ease from her spine. "I hope you have not been waiting long," he continued when she did not speak. He seemed uncertain, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the hat turning slowly in his hands. "The journey must have been difficult. Would you like to get something to eat before we head out to the ranch? It is about an hour's ride, and I have a wagon waiting at the livery." "That would be kind, thank you." Her voice came out steadier than she had expected, though barely above a whisper. "I confess I am quite tired from the travel." "Of course." He bent to pick up her carpet bag, and she saw him register its light weight. Everything she owned in the world could be carried easily in one hand. If he thought less of her for it, his face did not show it. "There is a decent restaurant just down the street. The food is simple but clean, and Mrs. Patterson does not overcharge." They walked side by side down the wooden boardwalk, and Olivia was intensely aware of the curious glances from the people they passed. In a town this size, a new face would be noticed immediately, and a woman arriving on the stage to meet a local rancher would be the subject of speculation and gossip before nightfall. She held her head high despite her dusty dress and wind-tangled hair, determined not to show the fear that sat like a stone in her stomach. The restaurant was a small establishment with 6 tables, and a counter where 2 men sat eating stew. The woman who emerged from the kitchen was round-faced and sharp-eyed, taking in Olivia's appearance with a single comprehensive glance that missed nothing. Dalton guided her to a table near the window and pulled out a chair with old-fashioned courtesy that surprised her. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Vance, who has just arrived from Pennsylvania," he said as the older woman approached with 2 cups and a pot of coffee. "Could we have 2 plates of whatever you have ready, and some water, please?" "Of course, Dalton." The woman's voice was warm despite her assessing gaze. "Welcome to Jamestown, Miss Vance. You have come a long way. I hope you will find our little town to your liking." "Thank you, madam." Olivia managed a smile that felt stiff on her face. "Everyone has been very welcoming. Mrs. Patterson poured the coffee and disappeared back into the kitchen, and Olivia found herself alone with the man she had agreed to marry. The silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy with unspoken questions. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, grateful for something to hold on to, even though the last thing she needed in this heat was a hot beverage. "Your letters did not mention how young you are," Dalton said finally, his blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I had imagined someone older." "I am 22, she said, lifting her chin slightly. Certainly old enough to know my own mind and make my own decisions. I meant no offense. He took a sip of his coffee, grimaced at the heat, and set it down carefully. I am only concerned that you may have expectations about ranch life that do not match the reality. It is hard work, Miss Vance. Harder than anything you have likely experienced in the city. I have worked hard all my life, Mr. Granger. She met his gaze steadily, determined not to be dismissed as some fragile city girl who would wilt at the first sign of difficulty. My family was not wealthy. After my parents died, I worked as a laundress at a boarding house, up before dawn and not finished until well after dark. I am not afraid of hard work. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that might have been approval or simply relief. That is good to know. I was honest in my letter about what I could offer, which is not much beyond a roof and enough to eat. The ranch is small, only about 200 acres, with maybe 60 head of cattle at present. I have 2 horses, some chickens, and a milk cow. The house is sturdy but plain, just 4 rooms and a loft. I do all the work myself except during branding and roundup when I hire help from town. And you want a wife because... She had not meant to ask so directly, but exhaustion and nerves had stripped away her usual caution. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee cup slowly on the table. "Because I am tired of being alone," he said finally, and the simple honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. "I built that ranch from nothing over the past 6 years, working dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. I have a home now and land and a future, but there is no one to share it with. I come in at night to a dark house and a cold supper, and I realize that no amount of success matters much if you have no one to share it with." He looked up at her, and she saw vulnerability in those blue eyes that made him suddenly seem less like a stranger. "I am not looking for perfection, Miss Vance. I am looking for a partner, someone willing to build something together, to face whatever comes as a team rather than alone." "Is that what you are looking for as well?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more significance than the simple words implied. This was the moment to be honest, to tell him exactly why she had come west to marry a man she had never met. She could offer platitudes about seeking adventure or wanting a fresh start, but something in his openness demanded equal honesty in return. "I came because I had nowhere else to go," she said quietly, watching his face for signs of disappointment or anger. "My parents died within days of each other last winter. They left debts that took everything we had to settle. I was staying with my uncle, but he..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He made it clear that his hospitality came with expectations I was not willing to meet. I needed to leave, and I had no money and no prospects. When I saw your advertisement, it seemed like the answer to a prayer I had been too frightened to voice. So I came with nothing but hope that I could make a life here, that I could be the kind of wife you need, even though I know nothing about ranching or cattle or any of this." She gestured vaguely at the window, at the dusty frontier town beyond. "I am not here because I have grand dreams of the West or romantic notions about ranch life. I am here because you offered me a chance when I had none, and I intend to work as hard as I possibly can to prove myself worthy of that chance." Dalton was silent, and Olivia felt heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had revealed too much, been too honest. He would surely send her back now, disappointed that his bride had come out of desperation rather than genuine interest in him or his life. "Hope is all we need to start," he said finally, and when she looked up, she saw something like understanding in his face. "I am not going to pretend I came from wealth or privilege, Miss Vance. My father drank himself to death when I was 15, leaving my mother and 3 younger sisters with nothing. I worked as a ranch hand for years, saving every penny I could until I had enough to file a claim and buy some starter stock. I built that house with my own hands, log by log. I know what it means to start with nothing, and I know that the willingness to work and hope for better is worth more than all the gold in California. He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. If you are willing to try, then so am I. We will figure it out together. The tightness in Olivia's chest eased slightly, and she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of this man who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than her uncle had in 6 months. "Thank you," she managed. "I will not disappoint you. I do not think you will." He leaned back as Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 plates loaded with beef stew, fresh bread, and butter. The smell made Olivia's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger, and she realized she had not eaten since the previous evening, surviving on water and determination for the last stretch of the journey. They ate in more comfortable silence, and Olivia tried not to wolf down the food despite her hunger. The stew was rich and flavorful, the beef tender, the vegetables cooked just right. The bread was still warm and the butter melted into it perfectly. It was simple fare, but after weeks of travel rations and boarding house gruel, it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. "Better?" Dalton asked when she had finished, and she saw amusement dancing in his eyes. "Much better, thank you." She set down her spoon with a rueful smile. "I am afraid my manners have suffered during the journey." "There are no judges of manners out here, Miss Vance. Eat when you are hungry, sleep when you are tired, and work when there is work to be done. That is the only rule that matters on a ranch." He stood and placed some coins on the table, more than enough to cover their meal and a generous tip. "Are you ready to see your new home? Or would you like to rest here in town for the night? I can arrange a room at the hotel if you prefer." The offer was tempting. Her entire body ached from days of travel, and the thought of a real bed in a quiet room called to her like a siren song. But she could see the careful way he watched her, waiting to see if she would choose the soft option or the practical one. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that her answer would set the tone for everything that followed. "I would like to see the ranch," she said firmly, "if you do not mind the company for the ride." Something that might have been pride flashed across his face. "I do not mind at all. Let me get the wagon and we can be on our way." The wagon was a sturdy farm vehicle with a bench seat and a bed behind for hauling supplies. Dalton helped her up with a hand under her elbow, a brief touch that was somehow more intimate than the entire conversation in the restaurant. He tied his mare to the back and climbed up beside her, taking up the reins of the 2 draft horses hitched to the wagon. They left Jamestown behind, following a road that quickly narrowed to little more than a track through rolling golden hills dotted with oak trees. The landscape was beautiful in its starkness, so different from the green abundance of Pennsylvania that Olivia felt she had traveled not just across a continent, but to an entirely different world. The sun blazed overhead in a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and dust rose in small clouds from the wagon wheels. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle lowing, and a hawk circled overhead on motionless wings. "That is the Miller place," Dalton said, pointing to a house visible in the distance. "They have been here since before the war. Good neighbors, though we do not see each other often given how much work there is to do. And over that ridge is the Thompson Ranch, much bigger than mine, closer to 500 acres. Jack Thompson runs it with his 3 sons. Decent folk mostly." "Mostly?" Olivia asked, catching the slight reservation in his voice. "Jack is fair enough, but his youngest boy has a mean streak. Tends to drink too much and cause trouble in town. He got into a fight with me last year over water rights, though his father made him back down. He glanced at her. I tell you this not to worry you, but so you know who our neighbors are. Out here, you need to know who you can count on and who to watch carefully. She nodded, filing the information away. In the city, dangers came from strangers in dark alleys and unscrupulous employers. Here, it seemed, the dangers were more personal but perhaps easier to anticipate. They crested a rise and Dalton pulled the horses to a stop. There, he said simply, and Olivia followed his pointing finger to a valley spread out below them. The ranch was small, as he had said, but it looked like something from a painting. The house sat in a clearing surrounded by oak trees, a solid log structure with a covered porch running along the front. Smoke rose from the chimney, which puzzled her until she remembered he had mentioned the journey would take an hour and must have made preparations before leaving. A barn stood nearby, weathered but well-maintained, and she could see a chicken coop, a small corral with 2 horses, and what looked like a vegetable garden surrounded by a wooden fence. Beyond it all, golden hills rolled away toward distant mountains, and cattle grazed peacefully in pastures bordered by split-rail fencing. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was something honest about the place, something solid and real that called to a part of her she had not known existed. "It needs work," he said, but she could hear the pride beneath the modesty. "The roof should be replaced before winter, and the barn needs new boards on the north side. The corral fence has some weak spots, and I need to clear more land for planting, but the bones are good. It will last." He urged the horses forward, and they descended into the valley. As they drew closer, Olivia could see details she had missed from above. Curtains in the windows, though they looked homemade and plain. A rocking chair on the porch, well-worn but sturdy. Flower boxes under the windows, though they were empty now, cracked and weathered from disuse. Small touches that suggested this had once been a home, not just a house where a man slept between work shifts. "My mother lived here with me for the first 2 years," Dalton said, as if reading her thoughts. "She made those curtains and built those flower boxes. After she passed 3 years ago, I kept meaning to plant flowers in them like she used to, but somehow there was never time." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said I needed someone practical, who would not be scared off by hard work." The casual mention of his mother's approval made Olivia's throat tight. She climbed down from the wagon before he could come around to help her, needing a moment to compose herself. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden, and the air smelled of dust and dried grass and something else she could not quite identify. Pine, perhaps, or sage. The front door opened, and an older man emerged, weathered and bow-legged, with gray hair and a face mapped with wrinkles. He looked Olivia up and down with eyes that missed nothing, then turned to Dalton with raised eyebrows. "This is Henry Walsh," Dalton said. "He has a small place about 3 miles west and helps me out sometimes during busy seasons. Henry, this is Miss Olivia Vance from Pennsylvania, madam." Henry touched the brim of his hat, his expression neutral. "Got the fire going and put fresh water in the pitcher like you asked. Anything else you need, or should I head on home?" "We are fine, thank you. I will see you tomorrow morning for the fence work." Dalton shook the older man's hand, and Olivia saw money change between them discreetly. Henry mounted a horse that had been tied to the porch rail and rode off with a final nod in Olivia's direction. The silence he left behind felt enormous, pressing down on her with the weight of all the unspoken expectations and uncertainties that lay ahead. "Let me show you around," Dalton said, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. She took it, feeling the solid muscle beneath the worn fabric of his shirt, and let him guide her up the porch steps. The inside of the house was dim after the brilliant sunshine, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. They stood in a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A fireplace dominated one wall, with a pot hanging over flames that licked at split wood. A table with 4 mismatched chairs sat near the kitchen area, where she could see a cast iron stove, shelves with dishes and supplies, and a dry sink with the promised pitcher of fresh water. 2 rocking chairs sat near the fireplace, and there were pegs by the door for hanging coats and hats. The floor was rough wood, but it had been swept clean, and the simple furniture was well made if plain. 2 bedrooms through there, Dalton said, gesturing to doors on opposite sides of the main room. The larger one is, well, it is yours if you want it. I can sleep in the smaller one or in the loft. He pointed upward, and she saw a ladder leading to a space under the eaves. There is a washroom out back, just a small structure with a tub and a place to heat water. The necessary is beyond that. It is not fancy, but it is all sound and keeps out the wind and rain. The careful way he avoided mentioning their sleeping arrangements made Olivia's heart race. She had known, of course, that marriage would come with certain expectations, but the reality of being alone in this remote place with a man she had met only hours ago suddenly felt overwhelming. "Mr. Granger," she said carefully, turning to face him, "I appreciate your consideration regarding the sleeping arrangements. I hope you understand that I will need some time to adjust to all of this before." She felt heat rising to her face and forced herself to continue. "Before we truly become husband and wife." He studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes serious. "Miss Vance, I am not a man who takes by force what should be freely given. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, you need only tell me. Until then, you have my word that I will not pressure you or make you uncomfortable in any way. We will marry when you feel ready for that too, and not before. I want a wife, not a prisoner." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her momentarily dizzy. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." "Now then," he said, his tone becoming more businesslike, perhaps to ease the awkwardness of the moment. "Let me show you where everything is, and then I have evening chores to attend to. There is stew on the fire, left from last night, and bread in the cupboard. Please make yourself at home and rest if you need to. We can talk more over supper about how we want to arrange things going forward." He gave her a thorough tour, showing her where supplies were kept, how the stove worked, where to find linens and towels. The larger bedroom contained a real bed with a mattress stuffed with straw and corn husks, blankets that looked handmade, and a small dresser with a cracked mirror above it. A window looked out over the hills, and there was a rag rug on the floor beside the bed. It was simple almost to the point of severity, but it was clean and felt safe in a way she had not experienced in months. After Dalton left to tend to the animals, Olivia stood in the center of the main room and simply breathed. She had done it. She had traveled across a continent, met a stranger, and now stood in what might become her home if she could prove herself capable. The future stretched before her, uncertain and frightening, but also full of possibility. She found a broom in the corner and began to sweep, needing to do something with her hands, needing to feel useful. The rhythmic motion was soothing, and she worked her way methodically through the main room, then the bedrooms, then out onto the porch. When that was done, she investigated the kitchen supplies and found that, while basic, they were sufficient. Flour, sugar, salt, lard, coffee, dried beans, and some preserved vegetables in jars. The stew on the fire smelled rich and savory, and she stirred it carefully, adding a bit of water to stretch it further and a pinch of salt to brighten the flavors. She was setting the table when Dalton returned, his face flushed from work, and his shirt damp with sweat. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the swept floors, the table set for two, the stew bowls waiting to be filled. "You did not have to do all this," he said, but she could hear the pleasure in his voice. "You must be exhausted." "I needed to feel useful," she admitted. "And it is far from the hardest work I have done." They sat across from each other at the table, and Olivia ladled stew into both bowls. The meal was quiet, both of them too tired and overwhelmed for much conversation, but it was a comfortable silence. Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity. "Tell me about the work that needs doing," Olivia said as she cleared the dishes. "I want to understand what my days will look like here." Dalton leaned back in his chair, considering. "The chickens need tending morning and evening, collecting eggs, feeding, making sure they have water. The milk cow needs to be milked twice a day. The garden needs weeding and watering, and there is preserving to be done as things come ripe. Inside, there is cooking, cleaning, laundry, and mending. Beyond that, during roundup and branding, I will need help with meals for the hired hands. And if you are willing, I could use an extra pair of hands with some of the ranch work as well, things like mending fence, caring for sick animals, helping with calving when that time comes." "I can do all of that," she said firmly, "though I will need you to teach me the things I do not know. I have never milked a cow or mended a fence or dealt with sick cattle. I can teach you." He stood and stretched, and she tried not to notice the way his shirt pulled across his shoulders. "But not tonight. Tonight you should rest. Tomorrow will come early enough." She wanted to protest, to insist she was fine, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. "What time should I wake?" "I am usually up before dawn to get the animals fed and the cow milked. But you should sleep as long as you need tomorrow. There is no rush." "I will be up at dawn," she said firmly. "If we are to be partners, then I need to pull my weight from the start." Something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. "As you wish. Good night, Miss Vance." "Good night, Mr. Granger." She retreated to the larger bedroom and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as the full weight of the day finally crashed over her. She was in California, in a house with a man she barely knew, about to begin a life so different from anything she had imagined that she could barely comprehend it. She changed into her nightgown with shaking hands, washed her face in the basin of water on the dresser, and crawled between the blankets. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and through the open window, she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Horses shifting in the barn, chickens making soft noises in their coop, the distant call of some night bird she could not identify. And underneath it all, the vast silence of the open land, so different from the city sounds she had known all her life. She fell asleep thinking about hope, and whether it truly was enough to build a life on. The sound of someone moving around in the main room woke her, while the sky outside was still more gray than blue. Olivia dressed quickly in the dimness, braiding her hair and pinning it up, splashing cold water on her face to chase away the last cobwebs of sleep. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Dalton building up the fire in the stove, already dressed and ready for the day. "Good morning," he said, looking surprised to see her. "I thought you would sleep longer. I told you I would be up at dawn." She tied an apron around her waist, one she had found hanging on a peg in the bedroom. "What can I do to help? Can you make coffee while I go milk the cow?" "There is a pot on the shelf and the coffee in the tin next to it. Just use water from the pitcher and set it on the stove to heat." She nodded and set to work, grateful for a task she knew how to do. By the time he returned with a bucket of fresh milk, She had coffee brewing and had begun mixing batter for flapjacks, using the supplies she found in the cupboard. He poured the milk through a strainer into a clean jar and set it in the coolest corner of the kitchen, then washed his hands and stood watching her work. "You do not need to cook a big breakfast," he said. "I usually just have coffee and bread. You need more than that if you are going to work all day." She poured the batter onto the hot griddle and watched it bubble and brown. "Besides, I need to practice cooking on this stove. Better to ruin breakfast than supper." He smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely. "Fair enough. I will not argue with anyone willing to make me a proper breakfast." They ate together as the sun rose, painting the hills outside in shades of gold and amber. The flapjacks were a bit unevenly cooked, some darker than others, but they tasted good with butter and a drizzle of honey Dalton produced from somewhere. He ate steadily, methodically, like a man fueling his body for hard work rather than enjoying a meal, but she saw him take seconds and then thirds and felt a small glow of satisfaction. "Today I need to ride out and check the cattle in the north pasture," he said as he pushed back his plate. "One of the cows looked like she might be having trouble yesterday, and I want to make sure she is all right. Henry will be here around mid-morning to help with fence repairs on the south boundary. If you are willing, I could use help this afternoon moving some supplies from the barn to the shed near the garden. But for now, if you want to start with the chickens, that would be helpful. I can show you what needs doing." She followed him out into the morning, breathing in air that already held the promise of heat to come. The chicken coop was a neat structure with nesting boxes and a fenced yard where a dozen hens scratched and pecked at the ground. Dalton showed her how to scatter the feed, where to find the eggs, how to check for any signs of illness or injury in the birds. "They are mostly pretty self-sufficient," he said, "but they need fresh water daily and the coop should be cleaned once a week. Watch out for snakes, especially in summer. They like to get in after the eggs." "Snakes," she repeated faintly. Of course there would be snakes. She had not even thought about snakes. "Mostly they are more scared of you than you are of them," he said, though his expression suggested he doubted that was true in her case. "Just make noise when you approach and give them a chance to leave, and you should be fine. If you do find one, come get me and I will deal with it." He left her to the task, and she approached the coop with more confidence than she felt. The chickens were indifferent to her presence, focused on their breakfast, and she found 7 eggs in the nesting boxes, still warm and perfect. She carried them carefully back to the house in the basket Dalton had provided, feeling absurdly proud of this small accomplishment. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. She washed the breakfast dishes, swept the floors again, and began familiarizing herself with the supplies and layout of the kitchen. She found a crock of sourdough starter that needed feeding and did so, hoping she remembered the correct proportions from watching her mother years ago. She inventoried the pantry, making mental notes of what was running low and what they had in abundance. Henry arrived mid-morning, riding a spotted horse and carrying tools for fence work. He touched his hat to her politely, but said little, and she got the sense he was reserving judgment about whether this city girl would last more than a week. She made coffee and brought it out to where he and Dalton were loading wire and posts onto a wagon, and both men accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, Miss Vance," Henry said, and there was something a bit warmer in his tone. "Good coffee is worth its weight in gold out here." She retreated back to the house and began preparing the noon meal, roasting a chicken she found hanging in the springhouse and boiling potatoes to go with it. The work was familiar and soothing, giving her hands something to do while her mind raced ahead, planning and worrying about all the things she needed to learn, all the ways she might fail. Dalton returned alone around 1 o'clock, dusty and tired. Henry had to head back to check on his own place, he explained as he washed up at the sink. The cow in the north pasture seems fine, just had a bit of a limp from stepping wrong, should heal up on its own. Dinner is ready, she said, setting the chicken on the table along with the potatoes, gravy made from the drippings, and biscuits she had baked more in hope than confidence. He stared at the spread with something like wonder. "This is more food than I usually see in a week," he said. "You did not have to go to so much trouble. It was no trouble." She sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap, suddenly uncertain. "Should we say grace, if you want to?" She bowed her head and spoke a simple prayer of thanksgiving her mother had taught her, aware of him sitting quietly across from her. When she finished, he echoed the amen and began serving the food, and she watched anxiously as he took the first bite of chicken. "This is really good," he said, and the surprise in his voice might have been insulting if it had not been so genuine. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother taught me when I was young, and I picked up more at the boarding house." She took a bite of her own cooking, relieved to find it really was decent. "I am better at simple food than fancy dishes, but I can make do with whatever is available." They ate in companionable silence, and Olivia felt some of the tension in her shoulders easing. She could do this. She could keep a house, cook meals, tend chickens. She could learn the rest. She just needed time and the willingness to try. After the meal, Dalton showed her around the barn and outbuildings, explaining what each space was used for and what supplies were stored where. The barn was dim and sweet-smelling, full of hay and the warm scent of horses. He introduced her to the 2 horses, a gray mare named Silver and a brown gelding called Buck, showing her how to approach them, where they like to be scratched, what signs to watch for that might indicate injury or illness. "Can you ride?" he asked as she stroked Silver's soft nose. "I have ridden a few times, but I am not skilled at it. I can teach you. Out here, being able to ride is important. If something happens and you need to go for help, or if I am out in the pastures and need assistance, you need to be able to get on a horse and ride without fear." The thought of galloping across these open hills made her stomach clench with nervousness and something else, something that might have been excitement. "I would like to learn. We will start tomorrow, just easy riding around the property to build your confidence." He moved on, showing her the shed where tools were kept, the smokehouse, the spring house where they kept things cool. "That building there is the wash house. There is a big copper tub and a place to heat water. Laundry day is usually Monday, but you can do it whenever you need to." By the time they finished the tour, the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, and Olivia's feet ached from walking on unfamiliar ground. But she felt more grounded now, more connected to this place. She could picture herself moving through these spaces, performing these tasks, building a life here. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sky blazed with sunset colors that defied description. Olivia rocked slowly in the chair that had been his mother's while Dalton sat on the porch steps, long legs stretched out before him. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a long silence. "Of course. Why did you really place that advertisement? I know you said you were tired of being alone, but there must have been women here in Jamestown who would have been willing to marry you. Why send across the country for a stranger?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "The women here have mostly known me since I was a boy working other people's ranches, barely scraping by. They remember when my father was the town drunk, and my family lived in a shack with a dirt floor. Even now, with my own land and a decent house, they see me as someone who will never be more than a poor rancher scraping out a living. I wanted someone who would see me for who I am now, not who I was then. Someone who would look at what I have built and see the potential rather than the limitations. The honesty in his words made her throat tighten. She understood that feeling of wanting to escape the weight of other people's expectations and judgments. "I think you have built something remarkable here," she said softly. "I hope I can be worthy of being part of it." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes catching the last rays of the sun. "I think you already are." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was exhausting but satisfying. Olivia woke before dawn, helped with the morning chores, prepared meals, tended the garden, learned to milk the cow with hands that cramped and protested until they developed calluses and strength. Dalton was patient in his teaching, showing her how to do things once and then stepping back to let her try on her own, offering corrections without criticism when she made mistakes. She learned to distinguish between the different calls of the chickens, which meant they had found something interesting to eat, and which meant a predator was near. She learned to judge when bread dough had risen enough, how to keep a fire at the right temperature for different kinds of cooking, how to make soap from ashes and lard. She learned to watch the sky for signs of changing weather and to read the behavior of the animals for clues about what they needed. And she learned about Dalton himself, in small pieces revealed through casual conversation and observation. He had grown up hard, with a father whose violence became worse when he drank, and a mother who worked herself to exhaustion trying to hold the family together. His 3 sisters had all married and moved away, one to Sacramento, one to Oregon, and one back east to Ohio, choosing husbands who would take them far from the memories of their childhood. He had been just 17 when his father died, already working full-time as a ranch hand, sending money home to help support the family. He had learned everything about ranching through hard work and careful observation, making mistakes and learning from them, slowly building expertise. When he filed his land claim at 22, he had done so with the determination that he would create something lasting, something his father's legacy could never touch. He was intelligent and thoughtful, quick to laugh at himself when things went wrong, and gentle with the animals in a way that revealed his fundamental nature more clearly than words ever could. On the 3rd day, he made good on his promise to teach her to ride. He saddled Silver, showed Olivia how to mount, and walked beside her as she rode slow circles around the corral. She clung to the saddle with white knuckles at first, certain she would fall, but Silver was patient and steady, and gradually she began to relax. "You are doing well," Dalton said, and the approval in his voice made her sit a bit straighter. "Try letting your body move with her rhythm instead of fighting against it." By the end of the hour, she was walking Silver around the corral without assistance, and by the end of the week, they had graduated to riding together out to check on the cattle. Dalton rode Buck while she followed on Silver, and he pointed out landmarks, teaching her to navigate by the shape of the hills and the position of distinctive trees. The cattle were magnificent creatures, larger than she had expected, with long horns and surprisingly delicate legs. Dalton knew each one by sight, could point out this cow that always calved twins, that bull that was sweet-tempered despite his size, another cow that had a habit of breaking through fences and leading others astray. "This will be a good year if we can get them all through healthy to market time," he said as they sat on their horses overlooking a small herd grazing contentedly in a meadow. "Prices have been decent, and I am hoping to add another 20 head in the spring if I can afford it." "Tell me about the business side," Olivia said. "What does a ranch like this earn in a year? What are the expenses? I should understand the finances if I am going to be a partner here." He looked surprised but pleased by her interest, and they spent the ride back to the house discussing cattle prices, feed costs, veterinary expenses, property taxes, and the dozen other factors that determined whether a small ranch succeeded or failed. She listened carefully, asking questions, making mental calculations. "We are getting by," he concluded as they unsaddled the horses back at the barn. "Not getting rich, but making enough to improve things bit by bit each year. If we have 2 or 3 more years like this one, I can think about expanding, maybe hiring a permanent hand instead of just seasonal help. And if we have a bad year, then we tighten our belts and hope the next one is better. That is ranching." He hung the saddle on its rack and gave her a serious look. "I will not lie to you, Olivia. There is risk in this life. Drought can wipe out our water supply. Disease can take half the herd. Prices can collapse. But I have savings set aside for emergencies, and I am careful about not overextending. We will not get rich, but as long as we are willing to work hard and be smart about decisions, we should be able to make a decent life here." The fact that he said "we" instead of "I" made something warm bloom in her chest. She was becoming part of this place, part of his plans for the future. It was both thrilling and terrifying. A week became 2, and 2 became a month. Summer heat intensified, turning the hills from gold to brown, making every task feel twice as hard. Olivia learned to work in the early morning and late evening, resting during the worst heat of midday. Her skin darkened despite her best efforts to stay covered, and her hands grew rough and strong. She could milk the cow without thinking about it now, could gather eggs and feed chickens, and hoe the garden with the efficiency of long practice. She and Dalton had settled into an easy partnership, working side by side during the day, sitting together on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, for one day having a proper barn with a hayloft and stalls for a dozen horses, for building up the herd until they rivaled the bigger spreads, for being known as someone who raised quality cattle and could be counted on to honor his word. She told him about her childhood, about her mother who had been gentle and kind, about her father who had worked as a bookkeeper and taught her numbers and reading, about the neighbors who had helped when her parents fell ill, and the ones who had disappeared when there was no money to pay debts. About the boarding house where she had worked, the endless parade of transient men and the exhausting labor that left her too tired to dream of anything better. "I am glad you came here," Dalton said one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I know it has not been easy adjusting to all of this, but you have done well, better than I had any right to hope for." "I am glad I came too," she admitted. "I was so frightened on that stagecoach, wondering what I was getting myself into, but this feels right. Like maybe I have finally found where I am supposed to be." He reached across the space between their rocking chairs and took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond helping her on and off horses or passing dishes at the table. His hand was large and calloused, warm and strong, and she felt a little thrill run up her arm at the contact. "I think we should get married," he said quietly. "Not because we have to or because it is expected, but because I want to. Because I want to build this life with you officially, not just as a business arrangement, but as true partners. What do you think?" Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts over the rush of blood in her ears. She had known this moment would come, had been both hoping for and dreading it. "I think I would like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Dalton." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the hills. "Then we will ride into town tomorrow and speak to the minister. We can be married by the end of the week if you are willing." "I am willing." They sat in silence, hands linked, and Olivia felt the rightness of the moment settle over her like a blessing. This was not the romantic courtship she had once imagined as a girl, but it was something better, It was built on respect and partnership, on shared work and honest conversation. It was a foundation that could support a lifetime. They were married on a Thursday afternoon in late September, in the small church at Jamestown, with Henry Walsh and Mrs. Patterson standing as witnesses. Olivia wore the best of her two dresses, carefully washed and pressed, with wildflowers Dalton had picked that morning tucked into her hair. He wore clean clothes and boots polished until they shone, and he looked at her with such open admiration that she felt beautiful despite her work, roughened hands and sun-darkened skin. The ceremony was simple, traditional words spoken by a minister who had known Dalton since boyhood. When it came time for the vows, Dalton's voice was steady and sure, and Olivia's only trembled slightly. He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and the weight of it felt momentous, like a door closing on her old life and opening onto something entirely new. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said with a smile. "Dalton, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief and chaste, just a soft press of lips that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through her entire body. When they pulled apart, his eyes held a promise of more to come, and she felt her cheeks flush. Mrs. Patterson had arranged a small celebration dinner at the restaurant, inviting a few of the local townspeople who knew Dalton. Olivia found herself shaking hands with the blacksmith, the owner of the general store, the postmaster, and several ranch families from the surrounding area. They were curious about her, asking questions about where she had come from and what she thought of California, and she did her best to be friendly and open despite her nervousness. "You got yourself a good man there," one older woman told her quietly. "Dalton Granger has worked harder than anyone I know to make something of himself. You take care of him and he will take care of you." "I intend to," Olivia replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. They stayed in town that night at the hotel, a wedding gift from Mrs. Patterson, who insisted they needed at least one night away from the constant work of the ranch. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and curtains on the windows, and Olivia felt strange luxury of being somewhere she did not have to cook or clean or tend to animals. Dalton was nervous, she realized as they stood awkwardly in the room after closing the door. For all his competence with ranching and his easy manner around her, this was uncharted territory for both of them. She suspected, though he had never said as much, that he was as inexperienced as she was. "We do not have to do anything tonight if you are not ready," he said, standing near the window with his hands shoved into his pockets. "Just because we are married now does not mean—" "I am ready," she interrupted softly. Her heart was racing and her hands were shaking, but she meant the words. She had been watching him for weeks now, noticing the way his muscles moved when he worked, the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her, the gentle strength of his hands. She trusted him, and more than that, she wanted him. "I am nervous, but I am ready if you are." "I am." He crossed the room slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and took her hands in his. "I will be gentle, I promise." "I know." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she felt heat building in her belly. His hands moved to her hair, pulling out the pins until it tumbled down around her shoulders, and he made a soft sound of approval. She reached for the buttons of his shirt with trembling fingers, and he helped her, shedding clothes until they stood before each other with nothing hidden. The lamplight painted everything in warm gold, and Olivia felt she should be more embarrassed by her nakedness. But there was something in his eyes that made her feel cherished rather than exposed. He touched her carefully, reverently, and when they finally came together, it hurt less than she had feared and felt more right than she could have imagined. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Are you all right?" he murmured into her hair, better than all right. She tilted her head up to look at him. I love you, Dalton. I did not plan to, and it happened faster than I expected, but it is true. I love you. His arms tightened around her. I love you too. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing at that depot, looking scared but determined. I just did not know how to tell you. You are telling me now. That is enough. They returned to the ranch the next morning, and life resumed its pattern, but everything felt different now. They shared the larger bedroom, and Olivia discovered the pleasure of waking beside someone she loved, of ending each hard day with the comfort of his presence. The work did not get easier, but it felt more purposeful now, building something together rather than simply surviving. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and the beginning of preparations for winter. Dalton spent long days cutting and hauling firewood, stacking it in cords near the house and barn. Olivia worked on preserving the last of the garden harvest, filling jars with pickles and tomatoes and beans, drying herbs to hang in the kitchen. They butchered a pig Dalton had bought from a neighbor, working together to cure the meat and render the lard, wasting nothing. Winter here is not too bad, Dalton explained as they worked. We get some rain and sometimes a little snow in the higher elevations, but nothing like back east. The biggest challenge is just keeping the animals fed and making sure everything is secure against the storms. How do you spend the time when you cannot work outside? Mending tack, maintaining equipment, planning for the next year. Reading, if I am being honest. I have a few books I go through over and over. She smiled at the idea of this rough rancher being a reader. What kind of books? History, mostly. Some novels. I know it probably seems strange for someone like me. It does not seem strange at all, she interrupted. Intelligence is not determined by occupation. I would love to see your books. He showed her his small collection, kept carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from dust and moisture. There were histories of the Mexican War and the settlement of California, a collection of Shakespeare's plays, several novels by Walter Scott, and a well-thumbed copy of Robinson Crusoe. She ran her fingers over the spines with delight. I can send for more books when we go to town next, he offered. What do you like to read? Anything, everything. I have not had access to books in so long. She pulled out the Shakespeare and opened it carefully. My father used to read to me when I was little. I had forgotten how much I missed it. That winter, they established a new evening ritual. After supper and before bed, they would take turns reading aloud to each other, losing themselves in stories of far-off places and different times. Dalton's reading voice was surprisingly expressive, and she loved watching him get caught up in a story, his face animated in ways it never was during the workday. The rains came in November, turning the world muddy and gray. They spent more time inside, and Olivia threw herself into projects to make the house more homelike. She sewed new curtains from fabric. She bought in town bright, cheerful patterns that made the rooms feel less austere. She made cushions for the rocking chairs and a colorful quilt for their bed, working by lamplight while Dalton repaired saddles and harnesses beside her. You are nesting, he teased one evening as she held up yet another embroidered pillowcase for his inspection. I am making this place a home, she corrected. Our home. I like the sound of that. He set aside his work and pulled her into his lap, kissing her soundly. Our home. Their first Christmas together was simple but joyful. They could not afford much in the way of gifts, but Olivia made him a new shirt from fabric she had been hiding, sewn carefully to fit his shoulders perfectly. He gave her a small music box he had ordered from a catalog, claiming he had bought it months before but been waiting for the right occasion. It played a sweet, simple melody that brought tears to her eyes. They spent the day quietly, just the two of them, cooking a special meal and reading and making love by the fire. It was perfect in its simplicity. And as the year turned toward 1877, Olivia felt a contentment she had never known before. She had a home, a husband she loved, work that mattered, and a future that seemed bright with possibility. Winter gave way to spring, and spring brought new challenges and joys. The cattle began calving, and Olivia learned to assist with difficult births, to bottle feed orphaned calves, to recognize signs of illness that needed immediate attention. It was hard, messy work, but deeply satisfying in a way she had never anticipated. She also discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, through missed monthly courses and morning sickness that had her running for the outhouse more often than she cared to admit. At first she said nothing to Dalton, uncertain and a bit frightened by the changes in her body. But eventually she could hide it no longer. "I think I am going to have a baby," she told him one evening as they prepared for bed. He froze in the act of pulling off his boots, staring at her with an expression she could not read. "Are you sure?" "Fairly sure. I have all the signs my mother told me to watch for." For a long moment he said nothing, and fear clutched at her heart. Did he not want children? Had they not discussed this before they married? But then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he crossed the room in 2 strides to sweep her into his arms. "A baby," he breathed against her hair. "We are going to have a baby. You are happy about it?" She asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy, Olivia, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and excited and grateful all at once." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "Are you happy about it?" "Yes," she said, and realized it was true. "Yes, I am happy, scared but happy." They told Henry the next time he came to help with work, and the old man actually smiled, a rare event. "About time this place had the sound of children running around," he said gruffly. "Congratulations to you both." Word spread through the community, and Olivia found herself the recipient of advice from every woman she encountered in town. Mrs. Patterson took her under her wing, sharing wisdom from her own experiences raising 5 children. The minister's wife brought by baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Even the wives from neighboring ranches, women she had only met briefly before, made a point to visit and welcome her properly into the community. "You are one of us now," one woman told her simply. "We take care of our own out here." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Olivia continued working as long as she was able, though Dalton fussed over her constantly, trying to take on tasks she insisted she could still manage. By midsummer, her belly was round and prominent, and she had to let out all her dresses and resign herself to waddling rather than walking. "You are beautiful," Dalton told her one evening as she complained about feeling like an ungainly cow. "You are required to say that as my husband." "I am saying it because it is true." He placed his hand on her belly, and they both felt the baby kick in response. "Look at you. You are growing our child, building a life with your own body. How could that be anything but beautiful?" She cried then, hormones making her more emotional than usual, and he held her until the tears passed, murmuring reassurances and promises that everything would be all right. Their son was born in late September, during the harvest season, arriving after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours and left Olivia exhausted but triumphant. Mrs. Patterson served as midwife, coaching her through the contractions while Dalton paced anxiously in the other room, forbidden from entering until it was over. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming lustily, Olivia felt a love so intense it was almost painful. Mrs. Patterson cleaned him and wrapped him in soft blankets, then placed him in Olivia's arms with a smile. "A healthy boy," she announced. "Good size, too. What will you name him?" "Daniel," Olivia said, looking down at the tiny face that was somehow both strange and perfectly familiar. Daniel Joseph Granger. Dalton was allowed in then, and he approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, his eyes fixed on the bundle in her arms. When he saw his son for the first time, his face crumpled with emotion, and tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect. He has your nose," Olivia said with a tired laugh. "Poor kid." But Dalton was smiling as he reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand, marveling when miniature fingers closed around it with surprising strength. The weeks after Daniel's birth were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. The baby needed feeding every few hours, day and night, and Olivia learned to function on broken sleep and sheer determination. Dalton helped as much as he could, walking the floor with a fussy baby at 2 in the morning, changing diapers without complaint, and taking over all the outdoor chores so she could focus on recovery and caring for their son. "I do not know how women do this alone," she said one particularly difficult night when Daniel would not stop crying despite being fed, changed, and rocked. "I could not manage without you." "You could manage anything," he assured her, but he took the baby from her and walked circles around the house, singing off key lullabies until finally, mercifully, Daniel fell asleep. As the baby grew and became more settled, life gradually returned to something resembling their old routine, just with an additional small person who demanded attention at inconvenient moments. Olivia learned to work with Daniel strapped to her chest in a sling, her hands free for simple tasks while he dozed against her heart. Dalton built a cradle that sat near wherever they were working, so the baby was always within sight. Daniel grew from a tiny red-faced creature into a plump, smiling baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He laughed at the chickens, reached for the horses' soft noses, and seemed fascinated by everything around him. Watching Dalton with their son, seeing the gentleness in those work-hardened hands as he cradled the small body, Olivia felt her love deepen in ways she had not known were possible. "You ever regret answering that advertisement?" Dalton asked one evening as they sat on the porch, Daniel sleeping in his arms. "Do you ever wish you had chosen a different path?" "Never," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be, with you building this life together. I have never been so happy, Dalton, never." "Good." He leaned over to kiss her softly. "Because I intend to keep you happy for the next 50 years at least." "Only 50, she teased. 60 then. 70. However long I get." The years that followed brought changes and challenges. A hard winter in 1878 tested them when snow fell heavily enough to trap them in the house for days at a time, and they had to dig paths to the barn to tend the animals. A dry summer in 1879 made water scarce and tested their careful management of resources. But they weathered each challenge together, and the ranch grew slowly but steadily. Dalton was able to expand the herd as planned, and then expand again. He hired a permanent ranch hand, a young man named Thomas who proved reliable and hardworking. They built a larger barn, replaced the roof on the house, and added a second story with 2 more bedrooms, anticipating the need for more space. That anticipation proved wise when Olivia discovered she was pregnant again in the spring of 1880. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Louise, arrived in January of 1881, during a cold snap that had Dalton frantic with worry. But the birth was easier than Daniel's had been, and Sarah was a calm, peaceful baby who rarely fussed. "We have one of each now," Olivia said as she watched Dalton hold his daughter with the same wonder he had shown with his son. "A matched set. Does that mean we are done?" he asked, looking up with a raised eyebrow. "I think 2 is plenty for now. Ask me again in a few years." Two became three when twins arrived unexpectedly in 1883. Boys they named Matthew and Marcus, who looked so alike that even Olivia sometimes had trouble telling them apart in the first months. The house that had once seemed spacious now rang with the sounds of children laughing, crying, playing, and arguing. The work multiplied exponentially, but so did the joy. Daniel grew into a serious, responsible boy who followed his father everywhere, wanting to learn every aspect of ranching. Sarah was quiet and bookish, preferring to sit with her mother and learn letters and numbers rather than play in the dirt. The twins were wild and energetic, getting into everything and keeping Olivia constantly on her toes. "We should have stopped at 2," she told Dalton one particularly chaotic evening when Matthew had gotten stuck in the chicken coop, Marcus had fallen in the creek, and Sarah was having a tantrum over a torn dress. "You do not mean that." "I do not mean that," she agreed, laughing despite her frazzled state. "But remind me of this conversation next time. I think another baby sounds like a good idea." The ranch prospered as the years passed. Dalton's reputation as an honest dealer and quality breeder grew, and he was able to command better prices for his cattle. They paid off the remaining debt on the land, made improvements to the house and outbuildings, and even began setting aside money for the children's futures. Olivia became known in her own right as someone who could be counted on to help when neighbors were in need. She assisted at births, nursed the sick, and organized the women of the community to support families facing hardship. The terrified mail-order bride who had arrived with nothing but hope had become a pillar of the community, respected and valued. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised her with a trip to Sacramento, leaving the children with Henry and his wife for 3 days. They stayed in a hotel far nicer than the one where they had spent their wedding night, ate in restaurants, and walked through parks hand in hand like young sweethearts. "Happy anniversary," he said over dinner on their last evening, presenting her with a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a chain. She opened it to find tiny photographs of their 4 children on one side and a picture of Dalton on the other. "So you can carry us all with you always," he explained, looking almost shy. "It is perfect." She fastened it around her neck, blinking back tears. "Everything about this life is perfect. You are perfect." "I do not know about perfect," he said with a laugh, "but I know I am the luckiest man alive." "You took a chance on a stranger with nothing to offer but hope and hard work, and you made all my dreams come true." "You made mine come true too," she said softly. "I came here running from a life I could not bear, thinking I was settling for safety and stability. I had no idea I would find love and purpose, and a family that makes every day worth living." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked across the table, and Olivia thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in Jamestown nearly 11 years before. She had been so uncertain then, so full of fear and doubt. But Dalton had been right. Hope had been enough to start with. Everything else they had built together, one day at a time, through hard work, honest communication, and a love that had grown deeper with each passing year. When they returned home, the children rushed to greet them with hugs and excited stories about everything that had happened while they were gone. The house was chaotic and noisy and full of life, and as Olivia stood in the doorway surveying the beautiful mess of their lives, she felt gratitude wash over her like a blessing. "Welcome home," Dalton murmured in her ear, his arms coming around her waist from behind. "Yes," she agreed, leaning back against him. "Home." Time continued its steady march forward, bringing new joys and occasional sorrows. Henry passed away in the winter of 1887, and Dalton mourned the loss of the man who had been like a father to him. They attended the funeral with all 4 children, and Olivia held Dalton's hand tightly as they said goodbye to a good man who had lived a good life. The children grew and changed, developing distinct personalities and dreams. Daniel, at 14, was already taking on significant responsibility on the ranch, showing a natural aptitude for the work and a maturity beyond his years. Sarah, at 12, had discovered a talent for drawing and spent hours sketching the animals and landscapes around her. The twins, at 10, were still wild but beginning to channel their energy into useful work, competing good-naturedly over who could complete tasks faster or better. "They are good kids," Dalton said one evening as they watched the children play in the yard before supper. "We did something right." "We did everything right," Olivia corrected. "We gave them a stable home, showed them what real partnership looks like, and taught them that honest work and treating people fairly matters more than wealth or status." "When did you get so wise?" he teased. "I have always been wise." "You were just too distracted by my beauty to notice." He laughed and pulled her close for a kiss that was interrupted by groans from the children, who had spotted them and were making exaggerated, disgusted faces. "Your parents are allowed to kiss," Olivia called out to them, not bothering to hide her amusement. "Do you have to do it where we can see?" Daniel asked, though he was smiling. "Yes," Dalton said firmly. "Absolutely yes, get used to it." As the 1880s drew to a close, the ranch continued to thrive. They now ran over 300 head of cattle, employed 3 full-time hands in addition to seasonal workers, and were considered one of the more successful medium-sized operations in the region. The house had been expanded again to accommodate the growing children, and Olivia had finally gotten the flower boxes on the porch planted and thriving, filled with bright blooms that reminded her of Dalton's mother. One spring evening in 1890, as they sat on that porch watching another spectacular sunset, Dalton took her hand and said, "I want to show you something." He led her to the barn, to a stall she rarely entered, and showed her the wagon he had been secretly repairing and restoring for months. It was freshly painted, with new wheels and seats, and in the back was a carefully packed camping outfit. "I thought we could take a trip," he said. "Just the 2 of us for a week or so. The kids are old enough to manage things with Thomas overseeing, and I want to show you some of the country I explored when I was younger. Beautiful places I have always wanted to share with you." "When did you become so romantic?" she asked, but her eyes were shining. "The moment I met you. I have just gotten better at showing it over the years." They took that trip in early summer, traveling through the Sierra foothills, camping under stars that seemed close enough to touch, swimming in cold mountain streams, and talking for hours the way they had when they were first getting to know each other. Removed from the constant demands of the ranch and children, they reconnected as partners and lovers, remembering what had drawn them together in the first place. "You ever think about how different our lives could have been?" Olivia asked one night as they lay side by side in their bedrolls, watching the Milky Way stretch across the sky. "If I had not seen that advertisement, if you had not placed it, if either of us had made different choices." "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I cannot imagine any other path that would have made me as happy as this one has. Every choice, every moment led me to you, and you to me. That feels like more than coincidence. That feels like fate. Or grace," she suggested softly. "Or grace," he agreed. They returned home to a household that had managed perfectly well without them, which was both reassuring and slightly humbling. Daniel had handled a problem with a broken fence. Sarah had kept everyone fed, and the twins had completed their chores without too much chaos. The children were growing up, becoming capable and independent, and Olivia felt both pride and a bittersweet awareness that the years of little ones clinging to her skirts were behind her now. "They will be leaving soon," she said to Dalton one night as they prepared for bed. "Daniel talks about maybe starting his own place in a few years. Sarah has mentioned wanting to study art in San Francisco. The twins are still young, but not for long. Soon it will be just the two of us again." "Does that make you sad?" "A little," she admitted, "but also excited. We will have time for ourselves again. Time to travel, to read, to just be together without always having to think about who needs what. More trips like the one we just took." "Exactly like that." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I am looking forward to growing old with you," he said quietly. "To watching our children build their own lives, to meeting grandchildren someday, to sitting on that porch when we are too old to work anymore and remembering everything we built together." "That sounds perfect," she whispered. And it was perfect, in all the messy, complicated, beautiful ways that real life is perfect. Not without challenges or sorrows, not without hard work and difficult choices, but perfect in the sense that they had built exactly the life they wanted together. Years continued to roll by with the steady inevitability of seasons changing. Daniel did indeed start his own small ranch with help from his parents, marrying a sensible young woman from a neighboring property, and giving Dalton and Olivia their first grandchildren, twin girls born in 1895. Sarah pursued her art, spending 2 years in San Francisco before returning to Jamestown to open a small studio where she taught drawing and sold her paintings to tourists and locals alike. She married a teacher from the local school, a quiet man who supported her dreams and made her laugh. The twins eventually went different directions, Matthew staying to help run the family ranch while Marcus headed north to Oregon to try his hand at timber work. Both wrote regularly, and the family gathered every Christmas no matter how far anyone had to travel. As Dalton had predicted, he and Olivia found themselves alone in the house again by the late 1890s. The children launched into their own lives, but they were not lonely. They had each other. They had the ranch that had been their shared project for decades, and they had a community of friends and family that had grown up around them. They made good on his promise to travel more, taking trips to San Francisco and Portland, even venturing as far as Denver one memorable autumn. But they always came home to Jamestown, to the ranch that represented everything they had built from hope and hard work. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1901, their children organized a celebration that brought together half the county. Tables were set up in the yard, loaded with food prepared by dozens of hands. Musicians played, children ran wild, and friends from 2 decades gathered to honor the couple who had become such a central part of the community's fabric. "Speech," someone called out, and the crowd took up the chant until Dalton reluctantly stood, pulling Olivia up beside him. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his weathered face crinkling with his smile. "But I do want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you for being part of our lives, for helping when times were tough, for celebrating with us when times were good. And thank you to my wife, who took the biggest chance any of us will ever take. She came west to marry a stranger based on nothing but a few letters and hope that it would work out. And somehow, against all odds, it did. Olivia, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Here is to 25 more years. At least," she added, and everyone laughed and applauded. The party continued late into the night with music and dancing and storytelling. As the stars came out and lanterns were lit to push back the darkness, Olivia stood with Dalton's arm around her waist, watching their grandchildren chase fireflies through the summer darkness, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "Happy," Dalton murmured against her hair. "Beyond words," she replied. "Beyond anything I could have imagined that day I stepped off the stagecoach, scared and uncertain." "You had nothing but hope," he reminded her, echoing the words he had spoken so long ago. "And you said hope was all we needed to start." She turned in his arms to face him, seeing the lines time had carved into his face, the gray that had crept into his hair, and loving every mark of their years together. "You were right. Hope was enough. Everything else we built together." He kissed her then, long and sweet, ignoring the catcalls from their adult children and the delighted giggles of the grandchildren. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," she replied. "Now and always." They danced together as the night deepened, moving slowly to music that had been popular when they first met, surrounded by the life they had created. The ranch spread out around them in the darkness, a testament to vision and hard work and partnership. The house stood solid and welcoming, filled with memories of laughter and tears, of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. As the celebration finally wound down and the last guests departed, Dalton and Olivia stood alone on their porch, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The air was soft and warm, carrying the sense of summer and promise. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "That frightened girl on the stagecoach, the young man who needed a partner, the years of work and joy and challenges, our children and grandchildren, the life we built from nothing but hope and determination. Any regrets? Not a single one." She squeezed his hand. "You? Only that we cannot do it all over again," she laughed softly. "Once is enough, but what a beautiful once it has been." They stood together in the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed words to communicate, watching the night sky and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for sleep. A cow lowed softly in the distance. An owl called from the oak trees. The house behind them creaked and sighed like a living thing. "Come to bed," Dalton said eventually. "Tomorrow will be here soon enough, and there is still work to do." "There is always work to do," she agreed, but she was smiling as she let him lead her inside. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Olivia thought about all the moments that had brought them to this place. The terror of arriving in an unknown land, the tentative first conversations, the gradual building of trust and respect, the moment she realized she loved him. The birth of their children, the challenges overcome and successes celebrated, the steady accumulation of ordinary days that added up to an extraordinary life. She had come west with nothing but hope, and Dalton had been right. That hope was all they needed to start. Everything else had been built day by day, choice by choice, together. She had found not just safety and stability, but love and purpose, and a family that filled her heart to overflowing. As sleep claimed her, wrapped warm in her husband's arms in the home they had built together, Olivia Granger felt gratitude for every moment that had led her to this life. She had taken a chance on a stranger and found her future. She had left behind everything familiar and discovered exactly where she belonged, and it was more than she ever could have hoped for.